I told my landlord I'd sent this month's rent payment. He looked confused and said, "Your lease ended 4 months ago." I was standing in the small office of Riverside Property Management on a Thursday afternoon in late September, my phone still in my hand, showing the confirmation of the $1,850 transfer I'd sent that morning. The office smelled like old coffee and copy machine toner. Mr. Whitfield, the property manager who'd handled my lease signing 18 months ago, was looking at me from behind his cluttered desk with an expression that moved from confusion to concern in the space of about 3 seconds. "I'm sorry, what?" I managed to say. "My lease ended? That's impossible. I've been paying rent every month. I'm still living there." Mr. Whitfield, a balding man in his early 60s who always wore short-sleeved button-down shirts regardless of season, pulled up something on his computer and squinted at the screen. "Mr. Holloway, according to our records, your lease at Unit 3B of the Riverside Apartments was a 12-month lease that began in June of last year and ended in May of this year. We sent multiple notices to your unit and your email address on file starting in March asking if you wanted to renew. When we didn't hear back, we assumed you were moving out. The unit has been listed as vacant in our system since June 1st. I felt the floor tilt slightly under my feet. That couldn't be right. I'd been living in apartment 3B continuously since I moved in. I'd never received any notices about my lease ending. I'd never been contacted about renewal. And I'd definitely been paying rent every single month without fail, $1,850 on the first, exactly as required. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, scrolling through my transaction history. "Look," I said, turning the screen toward Mr. Whitfield. "Here's this month's payment, and here's last month, and the month before. I've been paying $1,850 every single month since I moved in. How could my lease be ended if I'm still paying rent and living there?" Mr. Whitfield leaned forward to look at my phone screen, then his face went pale. "Mr. Holloway," he said carefully, "who have you been sending these payments to?" I stared at him. "To you. To Riverside Property Management. The same account I've always paid." He shook his head slowly. "Our records show we haven't received a rent payment from you since May. In fact, we were planning to send someone to check on the unit next week because we've been concerned about why it's remained vacant for so long when the rental market is so tight." The words weren't making sense. I'd been paying rent. Every month. The money left my account, $1,850 on the first, transferred to the account number I'd been given when I signed my lease. How could Riverside not be receiving it? Mr. Whitfield must have seen the panic starting to show on my face because he said, "Can you show me exactly where you've been sending the money?" I pulled up the transfer details from this month's payment and showed him. He compared it to something on his computer screen, and his expression got even more grave. "That's not our account number," he said quietly. "That's not Riverside Property Management's account. I don't know whose account that is, but you haven't been paying us. My name is Caleb Holloway, and I'm a 28-year-old software developer. I moved to Riverside Apartments in June of the previous year after getting a job with a tech startup downtown. The apartment was perfect. 1 bedroom, updated kitchen, walking distance to my office, reasonably priced at $1,850 a month. I'd signed the lease with Mr. Whitfield, moved in, and had been living there ever since. Or so I thought. I'd been meticulous about rent payments, setting up automatic transfers on the first of every month. I'd never been late, never missed a payment. I was a good tenant who kept the place clean, didn't cause problems, paid on time. And now I was being told that for the past 4 months, my rent had been going to someone else entirely. I'd originally moved into the apartment with my friend Austin Brenner, someone I'd known since college. We'd both gotten jobs in the city around the same time and decided to split a 2-bedroom apartment to save money. But Austin had gotten a job opportunity in Seattle after about 6 months and moved out in December. When he left, I'd contacted the property management to remove him from the lease and take over the full rent myself, or at least I thought I had. I'd sent an email to the address Austin had given me, received confirmation that the lease had been updated to just my name, and started paying the full $1,850 instead of splitting it. I'd never questioned it because everything had seemed normal. I received what looked like official lease documentation. I got confirmation emails. The payments went through without issue. Now, sitting in Mr. Whitfield's office, I was starting to realize that something had gone very, very wrong. "Can you show me the email address you've been corresponding with about the lease?" Mr. Whitfield asked. I pulled up my email and showed him the address. "Email protected." Mr. Whitfield's jaw tightened. "That's not us," he said. "Our official email is email protected. No dash, no additional letters. Someone created a fake email address that looks similar to ours and has been impersonating our property management company." The implications started crashing down on me. Someone had been pretending to be Riverside Property Management. Someone had given me a fake account number to send rent to. Someone had been collecting my $1,850 every month for the past 18 months while making me believe I was paying legitimate rent. I felt sick. How much money had I sent to this fake account? 18 months times $1,850. That was $33,300. Someone had stolen over $30,000 from me while I lived in an apartment I apparently had no legal right to occupy. Mr. Whitfield was already picking up his phone. "I need to call our corporate office and our legal team," he said. "And you need to call the police immediately. This is fraud on a significant scale." "But Mr. Whitfield," I said, my voice cracking slightly, What about my apartment? Can I still live there? Am I being evicted? He looked at me with something like pity. Mr. Holloway, legally speaking, you've been occupying the unit without a valid lease for 4 months. You're technically trespassing, though obviously you didn't know that. I need to consult with our legal team about how to handle this. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you don't leave the unit vacant because if you do, we'd be within our rights to change the locks and secure the property. I walked out of the property management office in a daze. It was 3:15 in the afternoon on a Thursday in September, and I'd just discovered that I'd been the victim of fraud for 18 months, had unknowingly been living in an apartment illegally for 4 months, and was potentially facing eviction from the home I thought I'd been paying for all along. I sat in my car in the parking lot and tried to process what had just happened. Who would do this? Who would set up this elaborate scam? And more importantly, who had access to enough information about me and my lease to pull it off? The obvious suspect was Austin. He'd been my roommate. He'd had access to all the lease information. He'd been there when we signed the original lease with Mr. Whitfield. He would have known the timing of when the lease was supposed to renew, and he'd been the one who'd given me the email address to contact about removing him from the lease when he moved out. I pulled out my phone and looked at the messages between Austin and me from back in December. He'd sent me a text saying, "Hey man, here's the email for the property management. Just send them a note about me moving out, and they'll update the lease to just your name." The email address in that text was email protected, the fake one. My hands were shaking as I pulled up Austin's contact. We'd stayed in touch sporadically after he moved to Seattle. I'd considered him a friend, someone I trusted. Had he been scamming me this entire time? I almost called him right then, but something stopped me. If Austin was behind this, confronting him directly would just give him time to cover his tracks, delete evidence, prepare excuses. I needed to think this through strategically. I needed evidence. I needed help. I called the police non-emergency line and explained the situation. They directed me to come down to the station to file a report. I drove there directly, still feeling like I was moving through a dream. At the station, I was directed to Detective Isabel Northrup, who worked in the Fraud and Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Northrup was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she'd been with the department for 14 years, according to the nameplate on her desk. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes in quick, efficient handwriting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "So you've been paying $1,850 per month to what you thought was your property management company, but the money was actually going to a fraudulent account for 18 months. That's $33,300 in total. And you believe your former roommate might be involved because he's the one who gave you the fake contact information?" I nodded. He's the only person who makes sense. He had all the information needed to set this up. But I don't have proof. "That's not your job," Detective Northrup said. "Gathering proof is my job. What you need to do is provide me with everything you have. All emails, all payment confirmations, all text messages, lease documents, anything related to this apartment and these payments. I'm going to need the account number you've been sending money to so we can trace where it's going." I spent the next hour forwarding emails, screenshotting bank transactions, and providing Detective Northrup with every piece of documentation I could find. She had me sign a formal statement and said she'd be opening an investigation immediately. Given the amount of money involved and the interstate nature of the fraud, Austin was in Seattle, this might involve federal authorities as well. In the meantime, she advised me to contact my bank to see if there was any way to recover the fraudulent payments, though she warned me that after this much time, recovery was unlikely. She also suggested I get a lawyer to help navigate the situation with my landlord. I left the police station and sat in my car again, trying to figure out my next move. I needed a lawyer. I needed to figure out my housing situation. And I needed to warn anyone else who might be at risk. If Austin had done this to me, had he done it to others? I pulled out my phone and started searching for tenant rights attorneys in the area. I found a firm called Kaplan and Associates that specialized in landlord-tenant disputes and fraud cases. I called and explained my situation to the receptionist, who said she'd have someone call me back within the hour. While I waited, I drove back to my apartment, or the apartment I'd been living in anyway. Walking through the door felt different now. Every piece of furniture I'd bought, every picture I'd hung on the walls, every part of making this place feel like home suddenly felt like a lie. I'd been living here under false pretenses for months without knowing it. I was a squatter in my own home. My phone rang 45 minutes later. It was Lawrence Kaplan, the senior partner at the firm, returning my call. He'd been practicing tenant law for 23 years and had handled numerous fraud cases. I explained everything again, the fake emails, the fraudulent payments, the ended lease, the potential eviction. He listened carefully and asked pointed questions about timing, documentation, and my communications with both the property management and Austin. "Mr. Holloway," Lawrence said when I finished, "you're in a complicated legal position. On one hand, you're a victim of fraud, and you've been making good faith payments believing you had a valid lease. On the other hand, you've been occupying a property without a legal right to do so for 4 months, even if unknowingly. The good news is that in cases like this, courts generally look favorably on tenants who were deceived. The bad news is that Riverside Property Management also has rights as the property owner, and they've lost 4 months of legitimate rental income because their unit was occupied without a valid lease. We need to negotiate with them carefully." He outlined a strategy. First, he'd contact Riverside Property Management to negotiate a temporary lease extension while we sorted out the legal situation. This would give me legal right to remain in the apartment and buy time. Second, he'd work with the police investigation to pursue the fraudster for recovery of stolen funds. Third, depending on what we discovered, we might need to file a civil lawsuit against Austin or whoever was responsible for the fraud. Fourth, we'd potentially need to work with Riverside's insurance company since they might have coverage for losses related to fraud. The retainer would be $5,000, with additional costs depending on how complex the case became. I agreed immediately and transferred the money that evening. Over the next few days, the investigation moved faster than I expected. Detective Northrup traced the account number I'd been sending rent payments to. It belonged to a shell company registered in Delaware called Cascade Property Services, LLC. The company had been created 8 months ago in January, right around the time my original lease would have been up for its 6-month review. The registered agent for the company was listed as A. Brenner, Austin Brenner. My former roommate and supposed friend had created a fake company, set up a fraudulent bank account, and had been systematically stealing my rent payments for over a year. Detective Northrup contacted the Seattle Police Department to locate and interview Austin. Meanwhile, she obtained a warrant for the bank records associated with Cascade Property Services. What she found was damning. The account showed regular deposits of $1,850 on the first of every month going back 18 months, my rent payments. But it also showed deposits from other sources. There were multiple other payments coming in, some for different amounts, some with similar timing patterns. It looked like I wasn't Austin's only victim. He'd been running this scam on multiple people. The bank records showed that money from the Cascade Property Services account had been used for personal expenses. Rent payments on Austin's apartment in Seattle, car payments on a new Tesla, charges at expensive restaurants, designer clothing stores, travel expenses. Austin had been living a lifestyle funded entirely by stealing rent money from people he'd convinced they were paying legitimate landlords. The evidence was overwhelming and detailed. Every transaction was documented, every deposit traced, every withdrawal accounted for. Lawrence Kaplan negotiated with Riverside Property Management while this investigation progressed. He explained that I'd been a victim of fraud, that I'd been making good faith payments believing I had a valid lease, and that I'd cooperated fully with law enforcement. He proposed a month-to-month lease extension at the current market rate while we sorted out the legal situation. Mr. Whitfield and the Riverside corporate legal team agreed, partially because they recognized I was a victim, and partially because Lawrence made it clear that if they tried to evict me immediately, we'd fight it in court, and the publicity would be terrible for their business. I signed a new short-term lease and paid actual rent to the actual property management company for the first time in months. Austin was arrested in Seattle 3 weeks after I'd first discovered the fraud. He was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, operating a fraudulent business enterprise, and multiple counts of theft. The Seattle police searched his apartment and found extensive documentation of his scheme. Spreadsheets tracking multiple victims, fake lease documents, templates for fraudulent emails designed to look like they came from legitimate property management companies. He'd been running this scam on at least 12 different people in 3 different states, stealing an estimated total of over $400,000. The arrest made local news in both Seattle and our city. Former roommate arrested for elaborate rent fraud scheme affecting dozens of victims. I saw my story reflected in the other victims who came forward. A woman in Portland who thought she'd been paying rent to her landlord for 2 years. A couple in San Francisco who'd been sending monthly payments to what they believed was their property management company. All of them had been connected to Austin in some way. Former roommates, friends from college, people he'd met through work or social circles. He'd systematically targeted people he knew, people who trusted him, and exploited that trust to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. The federal prosecutor handling the case was named Diana Ostrowski, an assistant U.S. attorney who specialized in wire fraud and financial crimes. She'd been with the U.S. Attorney's Office for 11 years and had successfully prosecuted numerous complex fraud cases. She contacted me to discuss my role as a victim and potential witness. She explained that Austin's case was strong, the evidence was overwhelming, and his pattern of behavior showed clear intent to defraud. He'd face significant prison time if convicted, likely 8 to 12 years given the amount of money involved and the number of victims. But Diana also explained the hard reality about restitution. Most of the money is gone, she said bluntly. Austin spent it. The Tesla has been seized and will be sold, and any assets he has will be liquidated to pay restitution to victims. But he doesn't have $400,000 sitting around. You'll likely receive a small percentage of what you lost, maybe 10 to 20 cents on the dollar if you're lucky. The rest is just gone. That hurt to hear. I'd lost $33,300, and I might only recover a few $1,000s. The rest of that money I'd worked hard for, money I'd carefully budgeted for, money I'd sent thinking I was being responsible about paying my rent, was simply gone, spent by someone I'd considered a friend on luxury items and expensive experiences. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early November. I had to take time off work to fly to Seattle to testify before the grand jury about my experience with Austin and the fraudulent payments. Sitting in the federal courthouse, waiting to testify, I saw some of the other victims for the first time. We recognized each other from news coverage and from the victim support group the U.S. Attorney's Office had organized. There was something particularly painful about meeting other people who'd been fooled by the same person, people who'd trusted Austin just like I had, people who'd lost sometimes even more money than I had. I testified for 90 minutes, walking through the timeline of discovering the fraud, providing documentation, explaining how Austin had been positioned to pull off the scam. The grand jury indicted him on all charges. His bail was set at $500,000, which he couldn't make, so he remained in federal custody, awaiting trial. His public defender tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Diana Ostrowski wasn't interested in being generous. The evidence was too strong, and the harm to victims too extensive. She wanted the maximum sentence. Back home, I was trying to rebuild my life and my finances. The $33,300 I'd lost represented a significant portion of my savings. I'd been living frugally, building an emergency fund, saving for a down payment on a house eventually. Now that savings was gone, I had to take out a personal loan to cover some expenses and start rebuilding. My new legitimate rent payments to Riverside Property Management were actually slightly higher than what I'd been paying to Austin's fake account. Market rates had gone up. I was paying $1,950 per month now instead of $1,850, which meant I was paying even more than I'd budgeted for. Lawrence Kaplan helped me file a civil lawsuit against Austin for recovery of the stolen funds plus damages. It was somewhat symbolic since Austin was in federal custody and had no assets, but Lawrence explained it was important to get a judgment on record in case Austin ever came into money in the future. The judgment would give us legal claim to any future assets he might acquire. We won the civil case by default since Austin didn't contest it from jail. I had a judgment for $33,300 plus interest and legal fees totaling just over $40,000. Whether I'd ever collect any of it was another question entirely. The criminal trial took place in March of the following year, about 6 months after Austin's arrest. I flew back to Seattle to testify again, this time in open court. The courtroom was filled with victims, journalists, and curious observers. Austin sat at the defense table looking diminished somehow, thinner than I remembered, wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of the expensive designer clothes he'd bought with stolen money. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he looked away quickly. There was no apology in his expression, no remorse, just calculation and resentment. Diana Ostrowski presented a devastating case. She walked through the scheme methodically, showing how Austin had created fake companies, set up fraudulent accounts, and systematically deceived people who trusted him. She presented bank records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent deposits. She showed the seized spreadsheets where Austin had tracked his victims and their payment schedules like a business operation. She called victims to testify about the financial and emotional harm they'd suffered. When it was my turn, I described our friendship, how I'd trusted him completely, how he'd given me the fake email address and watched me send monthly payments to his fraudulent account without ever telling me the truth. The defense tried to argue that Austin had intended to use the money to start a legitimate property management business eventually and pay everyone back. They painted him as someone who'd made poor decisions but hadn't intended to permanently steal from anyone. It was a weak defense, and the jury saw through it immediately. The evidence showed clear intent to defraud. Austin had spent the money on personal luxury items, not business investments. He'd continued the fraud even after accumulating hundreds of thousands of dollars, showing no indication he planned to stop or pay anyone back. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Austin guilty on all counts: wire fraud, identity theft, operating a fraudulent enterprise. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Diana Ostrowski filed for maximum penalties given the scope of the fraud and the number of victims. At the sentencing hearing, the judge heard statements from victims about the impact of the fraud. People talked about losing their savings, going into debt, developing trust issues, struggling with the emotional betrayal of being targeted by someone they'd considered a friend. When it was my turn to speak, I looked directly at Austin. "You were my friend," I said. "I trusted you completely. When you moved to Seattle, I was happy for you, excited about your new opportunity. And the entire time, you were setting up a scheme to rob me. You took over $30,000 from me while watching me work 60-hour weeks to afford what I thought was rent. You let me believe I was being responsible, paying my bills on time, doing the right thing. And all along, you were stealing from me and using my money to fund a lifestyle you hadn't earned. I don't know if you feel any remorse, but I hope you understand the harm you caused to people who cared about you." Austin was given an opportunity to speak. He stood up, looking smaller somehow in his prison jumpsuit, and mumbled an apology that sounded rehearsed and hollow. He said he'd made mistakes and wished he could undo them. He didn't look at any of the victims while he spoke. The judge wasn't impressed. She noted that Austin's fraud had been sophisticated, prolonged, and targeted vulnerable people who trusted him. She sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was ordered to pay full restitution to all victims totaling $416,000, though everyone in the courtroom knew that money would never be fully recovered. The marshals led Austin out of the courtroom in handcuffs. I watched him go and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served. He'd been held accountable, but my money was still gone. The year I'd spent dealing with this fraud, the stress and uncertainty and financial strain, couldn't be undone by a prison sentence. The betrayal of someone I'd trusted couldn't be erased by a guilty verdict. I'd learned a hard lesson about trust and verification, about questioning even things that seem normal, about protecting yourself even from people you consider friends. The restitution process moved slowly. Austin's seized assets, including the Tesla, were sold and the proceeds distributed among victims. I received a check for $2,847, about 8.5% of what I'd lost. The U.S. Attorney's office explained that Austin would be required to make monthly restitution payments from any income he earned in prison, but those payments would be minimal and distributed among dozens of victims. I might receive a few $100s per year for the next decade. The rest of my $33,300 was simply gone, spent on experiences and items that couldn't be recovered. I moved out of Riverside Apartments 6 months after the trial. The place had too many bad memories, too much association with the fraud and betrayal. I found a new apartment across town, verified everything directly with the landlord, set up payments through an official property management portal that I triple-checked was legitimate. I'd become paranoid about documentation and verification, saving every email, screenshotting every transaction, confirming every detail. The trust I'd once had in normal processes and relationships had been damaged, maybe permanently. My career recovered better than my finances. The startup I worked for had been understanding about the time I'd needed for court appearances and legal matters. I threw myself into work as a distraction and ended up getting promoted with a salary increase that helped me rebuild my savings faster. But I was more cautious now about money, more aware of how quickly financial stability could be undermined by fraud or deception. I kept detailed records of everything, multiple backups, verification at every step. 2 years after discovering the fraud, I'd rebuilt most of what I'd lost financially. I had a new apartment I could actually afford, a better job, growing savings. But the emotional impact lingered in unexpected ways. I had trouble trusting people, second-guessing friendships and relationships, wondering if anyone who was kind to me had ulterior motives. I went to therapy to work through the betrayal trauma and learned that being targeted by someone you trust creates a specific kind of psychological damage that takes time to heal. My therapist, Dr. Raymond Wells, who specialized in trauma from financial crimes, helped me understand that my hypervigilance and trust issues were normal responses to what I'd experienced. I stayed in touch with some of the other victims through a support group we'd formed. We shared updates on restitution payments, strategies for rebuilding finances, and emotional support for dealing with the aftermath. There was something valuable about talking to people who'd been through the same experience, who understood the specific flavor of betrayal that came from being defrauded by someone you knew personally. Some of them had recovered faster than others, both financially and emotionally. All of us carried scars from the experience. Austin's appeals were denied. He served his sentence at a federal correctional facility in California, far from the victims he'd hurt. I received occasional small restitution checks, usually between $150 and $300, representing his required monthly payments from his prison job income. By the time he was released after serving 9 years of his 11-year sentence, I'd recovered about $8,500 total, roughly 25% of what he'd stolen from me. The rest was gone forever. He was released to a halfway house in Seattle with 5 years of supervised release remaining. The conditions of his release prohibited him from working in property management or financial services and required monthly check-ins with a probation officer. I never had contact with Austin after the trial. Part of me wanted to confront him one more time, to ask him why he'd done it, whether our friendship had ever been real or if I'd always just been a mark to him. But I knew there were no answers that would satisfy me. People who commit fraud against their friends don't have explanations that make sense to those of us who wouldn't betray people we care about. I'd been targeted because I was trusting and because Austin had access to information about my lease and living situation. That was all there was to it. 5 years after the fraud, I was in a better place in almost every way. I'd bought a small house, finally achieving the goal I'd been saving for before Austin stole my down payment fund. I'd been promoted twice at work and was making enough money that the financial impact of the fraud felt less devastating in retrospect. I'd worked through most of my trust issues in therapy, though I remained more cautious than I'd been before. I'd learned to verify information, question things that seemed off, and protect my finances with better documentation and oversight. I still kept the judgment against Austin in a file folder at home, along with all the documentation from the case. Not because I expected to ever collect the full amount, but because it represented something important about standing up for yourself when you've been wronged. I'd pressed charges even though Austin had been my friend. I'd testified in court even though it was painful and embarrassing to admit I'd been fooled. I'd pursued civil action even though the chances of recovery were slim. I'd done everything I could to hold him accountable and seek justice, and that mattered more than whether I'd recovered every dollar. The lesson I took from the experience wasn't that you couldn't trust anyone. That would have been too cynical and limiting. Instead, I learned that trust should be combined with verification, that even people you care about can make terrible choices, and that protecting yourself doesn't mean you're suspicious or paranoid. It means you're smart. I verified my rent payments now. I checked account numbers against official sources. I saved documentation of every financial transaction. And I didn't feel bad about being cautious, because caution had become part of how I protected myself from future harm. Sometimes I thought about that Thursday afternoon when I'd walked into Mr. Whitfield's office to ask about my rent payment, completely unaware that my entire understanding of my living situation was about to collapse. The confusion on his face when he'd said my lease ended 4 months ago. The sick feeling as I'd realized something was terribly wrong. That moment had divided my life into before and after. Before I knew I could be so thoroughly deceived by someone I trusted, and after, when I understood that trust required verification and that even close friends could betray you for money. I'd survived the fraud and the betrayal. I'd rebuilt my finances and my life. Austin had faced justice and served time for what he'd done. But I'd never fully recover what I'd lost, both in terms of money and in terms of the innocent trust I'd once had. That was the real cost of fraud, not just the dollars stolen, but the damage to your ability to trust that people are being honest with you. And that damage, once done, never fully heals. You just learn to live with it and build protective systems around it. That Thursday afternoon in Mr. Whitfield's office had taught me that sometimes the most dangerous deceptions are the ones that look completely normal, that match your expectations so perfectly that you never think to question them. Austin's fraud had worked because it looked exactly like what I'd expected. Rent payments going to property management, confirmation emails, everything seeming routine and proper. I'd had no reason to be suspicious because everything appeared correct. And that was exactly how he'd designed it. The best frauds don't look like fraud. They look like normal life right up until the moment they collapse. I carried that knowledge with me now, a hard-won understanding that normal wasn't always legitimate, that appearances could be deceiving, and that the cost of blind trust could be devastating. But I also carried the knowledge that I'd fought back, pursued justice, and ultimately survived. Austin had stolen my money, but he hadn't broken me. And that was something. Not victory exactly, but survival with my integrity intact. And in the aftermath of betrayal, sometimes survival is enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.